In this video, I'm going to show you a simple but powerful system to help you remember everything you see, read, or learn. And let's be real, I'm not going to just tell you to use active recall or do spaced repetition. While those are great concepts, on their own, they're not really practical, actionable things you can implement in your life. So instead, I'm going to break down everything you need to know about how memory really works, why we remember, what makes memory really stick, and most importantly, the 5 techniques I've been personally using to ace business school, stay sharp in a high-pressure consulting job, and honestly remember way more than I ever thought possible. And to prove my point, here's an image that sums up everything we're about to cover. It looks random right now, but by the end of the video, you will remember everything in this picture. Let's get started. First of all, we have to talk about the fallacy of memorizing everything. That is, do you actually want to have a memory that never forget? Most people would instinctively say yes, but that's only because they've never truly experienced what's it like to recall every single thing they've ever read, heard, or felt. Fortunately, someone actually has this superpower and wrote a book about it. This is Jill Price, one of the rare individuals who can actually recall every single day of her life since childhood. She can recall any date and tell you exactly what she was doing, what the weather was like, and what major world events happened that day. She even remembers every breaking news story and how she felt when she heard it. On the surface, this sounds pretty amazing. But there is also a big downside to all of these. This is because Jill has a rare medical condition called hyperthymesia. On one hand, it gives her perfect photographic memory of everything, but on the other, it overloads her brain with an endless flood of past experiences, causing intense daily stress. So forgetting, as it turns out, is a feature, not a bug. It actually protects us from ourselves. So on the scales between a goldfish and Jill Price, we all fall somewhere in the middle. We don't remember everything because, well, most things are not worth remembering. We remember language, math, our favorite sandwich because, well, they're important and because we choose to. That is the goal for most of you who click on this video. But if you think back, you will notice that there are plenty of things that you never actively choose to remember, but yet they are impossible to forget. If you ask me where I parked my first car on any given day, I would have no idea. But on July 18, 2015, I remember exactly where I parked that day on Elm Street because on that day, some idiot keyed my first car on the back of the trunk. I wonder, why do I remember that so clearly after 10 years? Well, decades of research in this area tells us that our brains automatically remember things that are visual, important, and emotional. Let's call it the VIE principles for better memorization. And if our goal is to remember everything we choose to, that means we have to find a way to process our memory with these 3 elements. But it will be fairly tricky. I mean, it's pretty hard to get emotional about your 2-hour meeting memo or a finance textbook. Over the years, I learned 5 tricks to help me achieve those goals. And they kind of just loosely follow my daily routine. Take my mornings, for example, the time when I need to retain the most information. My morning read, email, stock market updates, most of this is text-based information that I need to remember quickly and accurately. And that's where the Sirianni Index card method comes in. I first learned this from another YouTuber a couple years ago, and it completely changed the way I took notes. And over the years, I just sort of fine-tuned it enough to fit my own learning style. The idea is quite simple. You document whatever you want to remember on a single index card, but in a very specific format to reinforce the VIE principle that we just talked about. First step, write a very short, simplified version of the key idea at the bottom of the card. This is your quick keynote, the core message of the entire card. You should be able to read it in just a few seconds and instantly recall the main point. Why at the bottom? Because people tend to remember the last thing they read. This is why closing argument in court trial are so important. The jury is far more likely to remember the final words than the endless argument made over the past few weeks. Step number 2, you want to use multiple color. Get a pen like this where you can write multiple colors. When your index card looks visually distinct from your Euro notes, your brain will actually recognize it. Oh, this looks different, and this must be something important. This tiny shift in perception actually makes it more likely to be stored in long-term memory. 3, make it personal. In the body of the card, explain the idea in your own word. Don't just copy the original text where you read it. Instead, write it based on your own understanding. Using personal examples like how does this idea relate to you, you want to make an absolute crazy example if you have one. And the most important part is step 4. You want to draw a picture. Sketch a simple illustration that represents the core concept. Of course, you don't need to be an artist, just something visual to anchor the idea. And here's my index card on Feynman technique. At the top, I've drawn Richard Feynman transforming into a stick figure because the whole point of Feynman technique is simplification. So that brings out the emotion because it's kind of funny. And it's visual, and since I'm making the effort to draw it out on a physical piece of paper, my brain will also think that this is fairly important. so it tends to remember it much better. Oh, in addition, this actually makes spaced repetition much easier because when you go back home, you can physically store it somewhere in your house and you can just take it out and read them in a random morning. Solidify your memory in a very little amount of time. So this is our technique number 1, Sirianni Index card. Very useful tool. Shout out to the creator State of Mind who actually invented this, and Ryan Holiday for the inspiration. The second technique is to avoid the illusion of competence. We've all been there. You pick up a book, highlight half of it, and then later realize you barely remember anything. Or you sit through a lecture writing down every single word like a human photocopier, only to walk out understanding maybe like 10% of what was actually said. If that sounds familiar, you've fallen into the illusion of competence. To explain that, let me give you an analogy. You've seen how squirrels stash food for the winter, right? They run around, bury hundreds of acorns, only to forget where they put half of them. The problem isn't that they forget. The real problem is that the squirrels think they've done enough to prepare for the winter, so they feel competent, and eventually they allow themselves to forget. This is exactly what most people do with learning. They treat learning like hoarding. We take a lot of surface level actions like highlighting in the book, speed reading, or mindlessly copying notes, thinking that we're absorbing the knowledge. But in reality, we're just hoarding notes, not actually learning it. You say to remember something, your brain moves through 3 stages of memory processing. The first stage is called sensory memory. That is a raw, fleeting impression of whatever you just saw or heard. Think back to the memory I showed you 5 minutes ago. Let me ask you, do you remember what the squirrel was standing on? If you don't, then that means the memory never made it past the sensory stage. You look at it, but you didn't actually process it. Now, if you had paused the video, actively thought about every detail, then your mind will actually move that information into working memory. Your working memory, also known as a short-term memory, only lasts about 30 seconds before it either disappears forever or get transferred into long-term storage. That means within those crucial first 30 seconds, you need to process information in a way that make it stick. So what do you do? How do you stop yourself from just going through the motion and actually retain what you learned? Well, the opposite of hoarding notes is to let go and trust your brain to think. Give it space and allow it to process information every time you try to remember something. And that is a key. You want to intentionally take gaps in between your learnings. Now let me give you an example how to do that. Whenever I'm reading a book, I use the summary stack method. Here's how it works. Once I'm done reading one paragraph, I took my time and think about it in my head and write a 1-line summary on the side of the book in my own words. Only then I move on to the next paragraph. But this time I summarize both new paragraph and what came before it. No matter how much I read, I keep my summary brief, but I'm actively thinking about what I'm reading instead of just letting the word wash over me. By the time I finish the chapter, if I find something that is really worth remembering, I'll take out an index card and write a final summary using the Sirianni method. Was it a lot slower than just reading through everything? Absolutely, but here is the difference. To this day, I still remember some of my favorite quotes from a book I read years ago, whereas before I would finish a book and after a couple weeks, I wouldn't be able to tell you anything about it. And that is a terrible feeling. So try this paragraph summary method for yourself. I guarantee you it will completely change how you read and retain information in the future. And tip number 3 is a revised Feynman technique. Now let's for a second put the book aside, because learning doesn't just happen when you read a book. Some of the most valuable learning actually happen in conversations, debates, and discussions. You'll probably notice that explaining ideas out loud forces you to think more clearly than when you're just reading on your own. And there's a very interesting method I discovered a while ago based on the famous Feynman technique, with a little bit twist on it. Richard Feynman, of course, is a Nobel Prize-winning physicist who is famous for his ability to explain complex ideas in a way that even children could understand. Basically, how it works is that pick a concept you want to learn, and you want to ask yourself, how would you teach it? And you imagine explaining this information to a very young child. And if you get stuck or you identify gaps in your knowledge, go back to the source and try again until you can explain it effortlessly. The reason why this works is that it forces you to actively process information instead of just consuming it passively. But when I tried Feynman technique myself, I found that there is a problem. It assumes that you already have a solid foundation of the subject, because if you don't, you will inevitably oversimplify or misunderstand the concept, leading to false confidence in what you think you know. And if you don't have a study partner or a mentor to check on your understanding, you might keep on reinforce that flawed summary without realizing it. That's why some people criticize the Feynman technique. On its own, it can set you on a path to understand the wrong thing. But there's a simple fix, and it comes from a concept called first principle thinking. I consider first principle thinking like a missing piece of the Feynman technique. Instead of just re-explaining something in simpler terms, you break it down to the fundamental truths and build back from the scratch. Let's say you're trying to learn public speaking, and most people will look at great speakers, take notes on their style, their tone, their stage presence, and try to copy what works. That's fine and all, but it's not the first principle thinking. And instead of memorizing the techniques, you simplify public speaking by breaking it down into the raw fundamentals. Ask yourself, what makes the people listen to the speaker in the first place? What are the core psychological triggers that makes the audience engage? When you dig deeper, you'll find that great public speaking isn't about fancy body language or voice tricks. It's about storytelling, emotional connection, and clarity. That's why this first principle Feynman technique worked for me for so many years, because only by stripping away the surface level tricks, you can get straight to the core of what actually works. And if you really want to go hardcore mode to remember something insanely complex and push your brain to the limit, there's also a technique for that. It's called the memory palace, and it's basically the king of memorization techniques. It's well documented all over the internet, and it's a technique used by memory champions to pull off mind-blowing feats, like reciting 3,000 digits of pi or memorizing an entire deck of shuffle cards in under a minute. Well, basically, instead of memorizing numbers or names or words the traditional kind of way, you convert them into vivid, ridiculous mental image and place them in a familiar location, like your childhood home. Then when you need to retrieve the information, you simply walk through the familiar space in your mind, letting each image trigger the memory. There's an actual number-to-image system called a major system, where numbers are converted into specific consonant sound that can then be turned into words. And here's a quick breakdown of it. For example, the 1 becomes T or a D, 2 becomes an N, 3 becomes an M, 4 becomes an R, and 5 becomes an L, etc., etc. And using this system, the number 314 could be turned into MTR, which you might remember as metro. So for example, if you want to remember pi, and you can start by remembering leaving the subway station and enter your room. That's a basic idea of it. And if you continue to convert number this way and placing each observed image in a specific location within your imaginary home, you can later mentally walk through the house, spotting each crazy object and decoding it back into numbers. This is how memory champions store and recall thousands of digits flawlessly. Difficulty numbers 5 stars. But it's undeniable effective. Your brain will flag those bizarre mental images as important. It's very visual, it's very personal because you are doing it in your imaginary house. It's also very emotionally engaging. Personally, I find this method a bit extreme for average folk like you and me. I'm not sure if there's really a use case outside of memory computation. That said, if you ever find yourself needing to memorize something really difficult, now you know how. Now, if you want to play brain exercise and learn new skill, an easy and interactive way to do just that is with Brilliant. Brilliant is a fantastic online platform that is absolutely the best way to learn math and data science or computer science or many other subjects. They've got thousands of lessons on all different topics organizing into different courses, which you can take on your own pace at whatever skill level you're at right now. Brilliant actually customizes those content to fit your needs so you can work at your own level. My personal favorite courses on Brilliant are the computer science ones. My undergrad degree was in engineering, and my programming level was never my strong suit. I managed to brush on my knowledge on the fundamental of computer science. These courses are a great way to build a foundation in coding, get experience with real-world applications, and learn to think like a programmer. I personally think learning every day is one of the most important things you can do, especially if you care about productivity and keeping your mind sharp. If any of that sounds good and you'd like to try out everything Brilliant has to offer completely for free, then head over by visiting brilliant.org/capz or click the link in the video description, and that will give you a completely 30-day free trial and you'll get 20% off the annual premium subscription. Thank you so much, Brilliant, for sponsoring this video. And finally, this last tip is something you can use every single day, ending your day by recalling everything that happened. If you know me, you know I've been keeping journal for years. But I'll be honest, sometimes I skip a day or two, and occasionally I go a whole week without writing an entry. You know, life gets busy, I'm sure it happens to everybody. But when I do have time, I like to go back and fill in those blanks. Because even if I didn't write things down at the time, I still want to remember what happened. And that's where this trick comes in. Whenever I'm too tired or just couldn't be bothered to write a full journal entry, I do something much simpler. I lay in bed and I replay my day in reverse. I start with the last thing I did before getting into bed, brushing my teeth, turning off light, and work on my way backward. What did I do before I brushed my teeth? Who did I talk to before getting off work? What fancy restaurant did I go to? Did my kids do well in school? What did I find interesting in the book I was reading? First, it strengthens my memory. By actively revisiting the event of the day, I'm reinforcing those information and telling my brain, this was important, don't forget it. And if I do that, I can remember that day's event for at least a couple of days when I have more time to fill in the entry in the journal. And second, it actually improves my sleep. Studies have shown that recalling vivid mental image before bed can help you fall asleep faster and improve sleep quality. So instead of letting random thoughts keeping you up, this technique actually gives your mind something calming to focus on. So if you ever find yourself struggling to sleep or forgetting what you did all week, try this method and take just 2 minutes every night to mentally rewind your day. But by now, I hope you see that it's not about remembering everything, it's about remembering the right things. And that comes down to the right technique, your daily habit, and the choices you make. And remember this picture? I showed it to you at the beginning of this video and asked you to remember it. Why did I draw the picture this way? If you can see the memory palace, the bed, the stick figure who's Feynman himself holding the index card, the picture is very strange. And the picture is this video. This is because throughout this video, you weren't just watching, you were learning the right way. You weren't possibly looking at the image like before. Now, you will probably never forget it. And whether you follow my system or find your own system, the most important thing is just to get started. You're better off starting imperfectly than waiting for the perfect method. This technique I shared with you have evolved over the years, and they will continue to evolve. Maybe in the future, I'll refine them into something even more structured, more powerful. And when I do, I'll share that with you. But for now, I hope this video has helped you in some small ways on your journey to building a better memory. And if you are interested in learning more study tips, I have another video listing all the tips you need to know about how you would learn as efficient as you can. I'll see you there.